They described a fire you could set once and live with for 12 hours through the night without electricity, without a fan, without a thermostat, without a service call. No moving parts, no app, no grid, just a controlled burn and a body of iron and brick that remembers heat. If a long fire is real, if a heater can stretch fuel across a full night, why isn't it everywhere? Why don't building catalogs sell it as the default? Why don't inspectors recommend it? Why don't appraisers value it? Is it a technical dead end or a systems problem? Codes, certification, insurance, financing, and supply chains? And here's the sharper question. Did we lose the method, or did we lose the pathway that let people legally use it? Welcome to Frontier Trapper. Before we open this archive, one thing needs to be clear. This is not a story about cartoon villains. The disappearance of good ideas is usually quieter than that. Incentives, liability, standardization, and economics can bury a technology without anyone ever conspiring. But the stakes are still real: money, safety, and the ability to keep a home warm when the grid fails or when the bill becomes the threat. In early America, stoves weren't decor. They were infrastructure: ordered, inventoried, repaired, fought over, and written into public building decisions. Colonial record and reports show stoves being purchased, installed, and managed as serious equipment, right down to fuel storage planning and the practical realities of keeping interiors habitable. Who was thinking about resilience back then? Politicians, professors, or the people freezing in drafty rooms? And why did they leave behind such obsessive detail? But here's what changes in the paper trail. In the same archival material, you find operating directions for warming machines that sound eerily familiar to anyone who has ever tried to slow a fire down, manage draft, reduce draw, keep heat steady for the rest of the day. Why were they already talking about controlling burn rate like an engineer centuries before modern certification labs? The catch is, those instructions were written for a world where user skill was assumed, where the operator was part of the system. By the early 1800s, Franklin wasn't just an inventor's legacy. It became a brand, a category, a marketing gravity well applied to many devices that weren't Franklin's at all. Historian-oriented stove collections show how the name was appropriated, how patents came and went, and how design drifted under consumer demand, sometimes toward pleasant, radiant heat, sometimes toward controllable, closed stoves. So ask the uncomfortable question: when a technology becomes a product line, what gets optimized? Efficiency, or what sells? Some mid-century patents explicitly chase air-tight control, tightening the box, controlling the draft, extending the burn. That's one of the doorways into the long fire idea. But why do we talk about it as nostalgia today instead of baseline infrastructure? By the early 20th century, wood stoves were widespread enough that later summaries described tens of millions of American homes heated that way. But then the arc bends: oil, gas, electrification, central furnaces, standardized parts, standardized service, and suddenly heating becomes something you buy as a system, not something you operate as a craft. Was that progress or a trade? But here's what changed next. Once heating becomes financeable, insurable, and code-listed, the technologies that survive are the ones that fit the paperwork. So what is a long fire technically? At its core, it's not magic. It's rate control and heat storage, two ideas that modern heating often separates but earlier builders combined. A fire doesn't want to last. It wants oxygen. If you control air, you control the speed at which fuel turns into heat and exhaust. That's why modern regulators and labs obsess over burn rates, operating categories, and repeatable fueling procedures, because changing the air changes everything. In EPA wood heater certification methods, burn rates and operating protocol aren't side notes, they're core measurement targets alongside heat output and efficiency. Why? Because without a controlled burn, you can't compare performance or safety across devices. A fire is a chemical reaction with a throttle. So here's the first question. If an 1840s operator could throttle a fire by skill, what happens when modern systems demand that the throttle be tamper-proof? Hold that thought, because tamper-proof design is one reason long burns can become a liability problem. The second lever is mass stone, brick, dense masonry, heavy iron. If you burn hot and clean for a short window, then store that energy in mass. You can release warmth slowly for 12 to 24 hours. That's not a slogan, it's the operating principle of masonry stoves and heaters. Burn hot, push hot exhaust through channels that transfer heat into the body and send cooler exhaust up the chimney while the heater becomes a battery made of stone. So why does this matter to the long fire legend? Because a 12-hour heating experience can come from two different strategies. Do you make the fire itself last 12 hours, or do you make the heat last 12 hours? Which one is safer, and which one is easier to certify? Because the part nobody mentions is that long burn and clean burn can fight each other if the design is wrong. When heat goes up the chimney, it's gone. Masonry systems intentionally strip heat from exhaust by routing it through internal pathways before it exits. That lowers flue gas temperature compared to a simple box stove, which is why these systems are often described as extremely efficient, but also why correct design and operation matter. Draft, condensation risk, creosote formation, and safe clearances become engineering, not folklore. Your chimney is part of the machine. So the next question is obvious. If the chimney is part of the machine, why do so many modern installations treat it like an afterthought? Let's anchor this in numbers, conservative, defensible ranges. 1. Masonry heaters are described as niche in the U.S., partly because of cost and size, with reported starting costs around $8,000 and common builds reaching $20,000 for site-built systems. That's not a small barrier, especially compared to mass-market furnaces. 2. One major barrier named outright is certification pathway friction, specifically the lack, historically, of an EPA emissions certification program designed for masonry heaters, even when they are considered among the cleanest wood heating options. If you can't certify it, how do you permit it at scale? 3. Certification methods can require conditioning time, 50 hours of operation before testing in some protocols. That's a reminder that labs are testing a device as a repeatable system, not a one-off artisan project. 4. Burn rate categories and minimum achievable burn rates are not trivia. They're formal measurement targets in EPA method families. In other words, the long fire dream lives or dies on whether you can prove controlled burn behavior under test conditions. Now ask yourself, if a method depends on operator finesse, what happens when the modern world demands proof a stranger can do it safely? This is where the disappearance begins, not in the firebox, but in the paperwork. So what does it look like when this is real today without mythology? A modern long heat system has to survive multiple filters. It needs a credible operating model that building science can understand. It needs a testing protocol that can measure emissions, burn rate, and heat output in repeatable ways. EPA certification test methods explicitly exist for wood-fired room heaters and fireplace inserts, defining scope, procedures, and how performance claims are verified. This is the language the system recognizes because it's the language that makes insurance underwriting and permitting possible, and it needs a code pathway that local officials can work with. The moment you leave standard equipment, you enter a world where inspectors may ask, where is the listing? Where is the manufacturer's installation manual? Where is the clearance spec? Where is the emissions certification? Can a future homeowner operate it safely? Here's a hard question. If a heater can't be easily appraised, can it be financed? And if it can't be financed, can it scale beyond the people who can pay cash? Because adoption isn't just engineering, it's also banking. We can say this: modern wood heat technologies that scale are the ones that fit formal measurement and certification frameworks, and EPA methods exist precisely to standardize how burn rates, emissions, heat output, and efficiency are determined. That's the modern gate. We can also say there are credible modern summaries acknowledging that masonry stoves and heaters remain niche in the US and Canada, and that barriers include cost, size, and certification pathway issues, not because the physics is impossible, but because market infrastructure prefers standardized, mass-produced systems. Now the uncomfortable payoff: the long fire isn't one invention. It's a category of solutions, some clean, some dirty, some safe, some risky, some compatible with codes, some not. And the system treats them very differently. So the next question isn't, did it work? It's which version works under modern rules. This is where people want a simple villain. But the better antagonist is the system a lattice of friction points that selects for some designs and quietly eliminates others. If your heater can't be listed or certified in a recognized pathway, you may not be allowed to install it, or you may be forced into expensive one-off engineering approvals. Meanwhile, standardized appliances arrive with paperwork that slides into the process. EPA test methods formalize what recognized looks like, and the part nobody mentions is that recognized can matter more than better. Inspectors can't approve feelings, they approve documents, clearances, chimney compatibility, installation specs, and repeatable safety assumptions. If a method requires a skilled operator to avoid smoke or creosote risk, how do you encode that into an inspection checklist? What happens when the operator manual is a tradition, not a document? Insurance is the gravity that bends architecture. Underwriters price risk. If they see a non-standard solid fuel system, they may raise premiums, demand modifications, or refuse coverage. Is that suppression or simply risk math? Because liability doesn't care how romantic the fire looks. A bank wants comparable comps. A unique heater that isn't common in the region may add little to appraised value, despite costing $8,000 to $20,000 or more in some modern masonry stove contexts. And if it doesn't add value on paper, fewer people can justify it. If resilience can't be appraised, who gets to afford it? Utilities and fuel supply chains thrive on predictable demand. A household that can heat with a controlled burn and stored heat reduces dependence, especially during peak events. Does that mean anyone erased the method? Not necessarily. But incentives do shape what gets marketed, installed, and normalized. Here's the moral payoff. What disappears isn't always the invention, it's the permission structure around it. So what do you do with this, safely and legally? This channel is about self-reliance, but not recklessness. A long fire that smokes, backdrafts, or coats of flue in creosote is not resilient, it's a future emergency. Here is a practical next step framework. Legal first. How many square feet? What climate zone? What insulation level? Do you actually need overnight burn, or do you need overnight heat stability? Are you chasing burn time or comfort time? Call the building department before you buy anything. Ask what they accept. Listed appliances, masonry heaters, site-built systems, engineered approvals. Ask about chimney requirements. Ask about clearances. Ask what documentation they require. What's the fastest way to kill a good project? Building it before you know the pathway. If your goal is self-reliance, start with something that can be safely tested and monitored: temperature, smoke, draft behavior, and how your space responds. If you pursue wood heat, pursue systems that fit recognized standards and testing logic, because that is the language of permitting and insurance. EPA certification methods exist because repeatability matters, and the catch is, repeatability is what turns craft into infrastructure. If you move toward a high-mass masonry solution, go in with eyes open about cost and market barriers. Reported modern cost ranges can be significant, and acceptance can vary. But where it's accepted, the value is profound. Heat without moving parts, heat that doesn't vanish when the power goes out. What is independence worth when it's 20 below and the grid is fragile? The most dangerous thing about forgotten infrastructure isn't that it was imperfect, it's that forgetting makes us believe we never had options. A 12-hour-long fire is not a myth to worship, it's a design question to reopen with modern safety, modern testing, and modern legality. Because self-reliance isn't nostalgia, it's permanence. If you want this knowledge preserved, documented, sourced, and kept alive, subscribe and share this film. Not for entertainment, for continuity. So the next time a good method starts to disappear, it doesn't vanish in silence.